Hey guys, it's Matt here. Battlefield 6's open beta became somewhat of an unexpected hit. Not to say that this is some sort of underdog story by an unknown and underfunded indie developer, but still, the amount of success it had is worth noting. The most successful beta in the franchise's history, a concurrent player count on Steam which rivaled full releases, massive interest in the game on streaming platforms, positive reception across the board, etc. Hell, the fact that this small and honestly quite restricted first taste of Battlefield's upcoming installment made nearly 500,000 people simultaneously enjoy themselves in an online shooter is already something worth studying. I can tell you beforehand that my first impressions are equally positive, and that Battlefield 6 seems to be heading in a direction that makes me really excited as a longtime Battlefield fan. Taking many aspects from franchise favorites and basically giving the people who are going to spend hundreds of hours in it exactly what they want. It really does speak volumes how an open beta made people go from remember no pre-orders to the Black Ops 7 trailer actually made me pre-order BF6 in a matter of days. But before you think that this video is going to be 40 minutes of me glazing Battlefield 6, everything that is on display so far has also made me very skeptical. As much fun as I've had with the beta, I also think it wasn't a very good representation of what BF6 is actually going to be. This is still EA we're talking about. This is still a microtransaction infested live service game. This is still an online shooter that will be released in one of the most divisive eras the video game industry has ever found itself in. So with that being said, let's take a peek into those 2 weekends that made every middle-aged guy disregard their day-to-day responsibilities, made Call of Duty fans rethink their life choices, and made streamers spew out the most one-sided hot takes I've ever heard, as I'll show you some gameplay and my incredibly positive but equally reserved and cautious first impressions of the Battlefield 6 open beta. In my overly long Battlefield 1 video, I've talked about how it's very easy to look back at that game as a massive and instant success without any sort of risk involved. While in reality, that couldn't actually be farther from the truth. Setting a Battlefield game in an at that point unexplored and unproven time period, right after not only the massive success of modern military shooters BF3 and 4, but also the failure of adapting a new setting into the franchise with BF Hardline. Right at a time where almost the entirety of the FPS market was focused on basically the exact opposite of World War I. In short, BF1 was actually a massive gamble. Now, why is that important to mention? Well, because in contrast to BF1, Battlefield 6 is about the safest bet that the development teams at the newly merged Battlefield Studios could have gone for. Battlefield 1 created intrigue and excitement by combining Battlefield's core gameplay with a radical new setting. We didn't know we wanted Battlefield 1 even though DICE seemingly knew what they were doing. Yet, if you ask the large majority of people what they would want from a new Battlefield title, chances are very high they wouldn't say BF1. They'd say BF3. Case in point, Battlefield 6. Battlefield 6 is shaping up to be a really great amalgamation of what worked in the past, what the fans really want from it, but also what the wider FPS market is, in my opinion, sorely lacking right now. And the largely positive way people responded to it so far can be attributed to the sort of game it's trying to be, the sort of people it's trying to appeal to, and the sorts of lessons it has learned from previous games. I think the best way to go about it is to talk about all the things I really like about it, all the things that are newly introduced in the game, and of course all the things I think it doesn't do well. So let's start with all the good aspects. With its subdued color scheme and overall more serious tone, Battlefield 6 almost feels like a direct sequel to DICE's most popular installment, Battlefield 3. Specifically BF3 to be clear, because in many ways BF6 is much more similar to it than to its nowadays equally popular but much more divisive sequel, Battlefield 4. Where in the former two, the action stays pretty firmly rooted in reality despite its entertaining and over-the-top nature. In the latter, you can level a skyscraper and flood an entire city. I like both in their own respective ways, but when looking at the wider FPS market right now, I'm glad they took the more grounded approach. It's nice to finally see a AAA FPS take on a more serious tone again, while all the competition is desperately trying to cash in on Fortnite's crossover insanity. Just having a bunch of soldiers in your team that actually look like normal soldiers feels like a genuine breath of fresh air. All the maps that were playable in the open beta attribute to this tone as well. Each one of them would feel right at home between the likes of Strike at Garkant and Sane Crossing. Especially the tight alleyways in Siege of Cairo immediately made me think of something like Grand Bazaar, and it's no surprise at all that with a setting like this one, BF6 will see the return of fan favorite Operation Firestorm. More similarities can of course be found in its weapons, vehicles and equipment. It's almost funny to say that BF6 is a modern military shooter, when so much of the things portrayed in this game are very similar to a game that came out in 2011. Let alone that a lot of these weapons and vehicles were already heading towards their 30th or even 40th birthday at that point. That's not a complaint though. It's great to see the Apache return, and would a Battlefield game really be complete without the sound of the Abrams' turbine engine? Same goes for the guns. I love the G36 and the MP7 no matter what sort of weird ass copyright dodging names they give these things nowadays. But luckily it isn't exclusively a bunch of old stuff. I think it's really cool to see some new additions in this regard as well. Using the CV90 as well as seeing all those burnt out Leopard 2s makes me really excited for a larger focus on NATO used weaponry in BF6. The more grounded approach BF6 is taking can be found in every aspect of the game. Let's start with its movement. I'm very happy to see that the game is turning away from the more twitchy and slidey movement we saw in its predecessor, Battlefield 2042. The tactical sprinting and sliding around, which feels much more at home in an arena shooter, made that game feel way too chaotic and lightweight for what is normally seen in this franchise. At this point I do still think that Battlefield 6 is a bit too fast, especially in comparison to older Battlefield titles. You've probably also encountered some of those videos where people started exploiting the jump and slide mechanics in order to reach insane speeds. That feels ridiculously out of place in a Battlefield game. In general though, it is definitely a step up from that previous iteration. I've also had several instances where it felt like there was little to no downtime in between firefights. This is caused in part by the size of these maps, but that's something I'll get to later on in the video. On a more technical level, I think this is caused by some problems with the game's TTD. More than a few times it felt like I was getting killed instantly with zero time to respond. And that can be very frustrating, especially when it happens in those moments where you're absolutely sure that you've already safely thrown yourself into cover. Granted, this was also in large part because of that god-awful shotgun that I refused to use myself because of how broken it was, but it's still worth noting. The developers have already announced that they're working on improvements for both the movement and the TTD, which is great news, but I guess that means we're just gonna have to wait and see what changes in the full release. Weapons have seen a bunch of improvements in this regard as well. While most of the weapons in 2042 felt like auto-aiming laser beams without any sort of visible recoil, as well as that this made the distinct differences between specific weapon types feel a lot less, well, distinctive, BF6 again is doing it much better here. The gunplay feels really great and responsive, and each weapon class feels at least more distinct here than in the previous game. Assault rifles feel like a nice middle ground. Submachine guns more fast-paced and great for close range while being less effective on longer ranges. LMGs feel nice and bulky and definitely sound the greatest of all weapons. And snipers are of course really enjoyable to use on longer ranges, despite making Liberation Peak's center hillside light up like a fucking Christmas tree. If it were up to me, I'd dial up the differences between these specific weapon classes even more, so that they feel more distinct from each other and so that each class will have a way more specific function within a team. Basically just like in BF1 and 5. In my opinion, there's just no place for a quote-unquote meta in a game like Battlefield, where all weapons should feel useful, but also every single weapon has a very specific task. Which is why I really hope that the developers nerf the shotgun into absolute oblivion before release. DMRs could actually use a slight buff. I love myself a good old semi-automatic rifle like the M39, but on close ranges it feels laughably underpowered. I understand that nobody wants to return to BF4's DMR dominance, but if I'm shooting someone 4 times point blank with 7.62 NATO, I don't expect them to behave like they've just been stung by a mosquito. I also want to specifically talk about how weapon customization is implemented in this game. Never really Battlefield's strong suit, it always felt like the customization menus are just needlessly clunky. Strangely unclear and tucked away in BF3 and 4, cluttered and filled to the brim with useless attachments and an unnecessary plus system in BF 2042, and the less said about BF1's variant system, the better. So just getting a simple, tried and true customization menu that works with a point system and very clear statistics really makes it a joy to start personalizing your weapons again. It's not as over the top as Call of Duty's gunsmith mechanics, but honestly I'm okay with that, and it's comforting to know that Jonathan Ferguson will not get any nightmares from it. Battlefield wouldn't feel complete without a wide variety of gadgets. The repair tool, defibrillator and spawn beacon are as important to its core gameplay as weapons or vehicles are. I'm very glad that the game's PC trailer, that released after the open beta, also confirmed the very welcome return of things like the sniper decoy, mortars, the EOD bot and throwing knives. We'll see how useful these actually turn out to be, but the more equipment we have, the bigger the sandbox. And of course we have to talk about the vehicles as well. If I have to be positive about one aspect that is brought over from Battlefield 2042, it's the vehicles. Or to be more precise, the vehicle handling as it is present in the Portal mode. Despite being an essential part of Battlefield games, many installments actually don't have the best vehicle handling, and physics-wise, these things can be all over the place. While I feel like most transport vehicles have already seen a massive improvement in their handling and mobility in 2042's normal game modes, I personally mostly enjoy the way vehicles handle in Portal. Tanks had a tendency to feel very fast and lightweight in 2042's normal modes, and I felt like the suspension of these vehicles in earlier games felt way too bouncy for a vehicle that is this heavy. Which is why I really enjoy the more bulky feel of the Abrams in Portal. These tracked vehicles now actually feel like they're on tracks instead of road wheels, which is really awesome. The visibility in tanks hasn't been the greatest, especially with all the flying debris and smoke in tight corridors. It's very easy to lose your orientation with them. Switching from third person to first person view is honestly one of the most clunky aspects of this game, so I'd love to see them improve this in some sort of way, if that's even possible. As far as I've heard online, the handling of helicopters and jets is a bit more stiff and clunky in BF6 and requires you to mess around with your sensitivity here and there. But you can really convince me of anything in that regard, because all my experiences in air vehicles so far resulted in something that looked like this. And last but definitely not least, the biggest compliments I can give Battlefield 6 have to do with the graphics and sound design and its performance and optimization. Leave it up to a franchise that has garnered critical acclaim for the visual spectacles they were able to produce to put out yet another incredibly impressive display, which was desperately needed after DICE's previous outing. Don't get me wrong, Battlefield 2042 with its massive maps and 128 player chaos isn't a bad looking game by any means. There are moments where I'm looking into the distance on maps like Breakaway and Exposure where I tend to forget it's a video game instead of a nature documentary. but I still think in many ways it's a notable downgrade from the baffling visuals we've seen in BF1 and 5. Honestly, it's still very difficult for any game to live up to the expectations that were set in those games as far as graphics and sound design goes. I'm happy to say that I think Battlefield 6 is at least on par with those games. Weapon models look beautifully detailed, character models and animations are all top tier, and the sound is just as unbelievably perfect as always. Even if you end up hating Battlefield 6 gameplay wise, you cannot deny it is a looker. Most notably in one of the key features of Battlefield games, its destruction. Every new Battlefield game needs to find a nice middle ground between the amount of destruction you can cause and the way that impacts the overall layout of a map. The very limited amount of destruction you could cause in Battlefield 2042 is one of the, admittedly very many, reasons why the game isn't as well liked as the others in the franchise. So I am glad to see massive improvements in this regard. Though I would have loved to see these developers turn the dial all the way up to Bad Company 2's levels, where maps could quite literally change into barren wastelands with the amount of destruction you could cause. I do have to admit that it messes up gameplay, balance and map design so much that it would have never worked here. Which is why it's a good thing that BF6 takes a similar approach as BF3 and 1, where the core structure of a building will always remain intact despite the ability to completely obliterate many of its walls, ceilings and floors. It's an understandable design choice, and if anything, Battlefield 6 with its improved particle effects and volumetric smoke really makes this destruction at least look much more impressive. I love the fact that with BF6's destruction and the amount of debris and smoke it throws around, you can actually use it to your advantage by blinding the enemy and concealing your movement. That is awesome. No need to worry about people camping the corners either when you have the ability to completely delete said corner. That's exactly the sort of mayhem you want to see here. The Battlefield franchise has an incredibly spotty track record when it comes to the performance of their games around launch. Many a Battlefield fan still wakes up in a cold sweat every now and then when thinking back to BF4's netcode, BF5's TTK, and especially 2042's god-awful hit registration and weapon bloom. Which makes it even more impressive to see BF6's open beta run as well as it did. Sure, every game in this franchise looks great visually, but when 64 players can simultaneously cause this much chaos in a game with these sorts of graphics, yet it still has a remarkably stable frame rate and the game doesn't just straight up break, that's the moment when you really start feeling not only that the combined efforts and quality control of the Battlefield studios is paying off, but also that Battlefield 6 is undeniably taking that definitive step into the current gen of hardware without being held back by the previous one. And yes, of course, there were some bugs and glitches present throughout those 2 weekends. The glitchy black epileptic seizure that occurred on Liberation Peak here and there was just as annoying as it looks, but things like your corpse shooting into the stratosphere when being shot by a cannon were actually kinda funny, and DICE even straight up acknowledged the chair meme themselves. That's all fine. Bugs are to be expected in an open beta. Not as much as in 2042 of course, but even BF3 had its fair share of hilarious fuck-ups back in the day. So I guess you can understand why the open beta was as well liked. But so far I've talked about a lot of improvements and stuff from previous games that makes BF6 great, but I think it's time to talk about the actual new stuff as well. I think that you're going to find most of your enjoyment in Battlefield 6's quality of life improvements and its attention to detail. And the best new feature by far is the fact that you can drag people to safety while reviving. In its core, this seems rather insignificant, but just think of all the work the developers must have put into something like this in order to make sure that it all works without both characters glitching out in the most broken way imaginable. Honestly, this is such a well implemented and useful feature that I instantly started missing it when going back to older installments. That's how good it is. But there are actually a lot of these seemingly small improvements in the game. only getting your killer's last known location instead of following their complete movement for 30 seconds straight, all the information on how and where you were shot, defibrillators losing that god-awful cooldown time it had in 2042, snipers cancelling out revives when they perform a headshot, being able to hang on the back of a tank when all the seats are taken, your squad revive still counting when a much faster medic steals it halfway through, actually trying to balance having two primary weapons when you choose a shotgun as a secondary by giving the other gun less ammo, the very enjoyable voice lines you'll hear during a match,
I'm tracking a big fucking tank in the mission area.
the firing range returning, doing damage simply by throwing a grenade against someone's head. I mean, I can go on for hours. These sorts of aspects are probably more enjoyable for people who have been with this franchise for years at this point, but combine all of it and it makes this game feel so incredibly polished. I will admit though that these are very small aspects of the game that don't really impact the core of Battlefield 6 as much. Remove or change these things despite how much I like them and you will still have an experience that feels like a Battlefield game. There are, however, some more substantial changes being made to this game, and I think they are best explained by comparing BF6 to a game outside of its own back catalog. Modern Warfare 2019.
Bravo 6. Going dark.
It's not a secret that FPS games constantly borrow mechanics and features from each other, and there's no shame in that. But if Call of Duty is proving anything right now, it is that it's very important to always stay close to the core of what made a franchise great in the first place. I think a lot of people will agree with me that when I want to play Fortnite, I'll play Fortnite, and I don't need Call of Duty to fill that spot. That's why right in between much more extravagant, futuristic or even cartoonish installments, the Modern Warfare reboot felt like the game that many of the franchise's longtime fans had been desperately begging for. A new engine, more attention to detail in its weapons and character models, a more grounded approach and serious tone in its storytelling and gameplay, and a setting and identity that felt more like the games that made that franchise popular in the first place. Personally, I bought it because, despite the things I already mentioned, it also felt like the game that many Battlefield fans were hoping for. Especially after the pretty disappointing launch of BF5 a year prior, a game that also massively struggled with an identity crisis. The Modern Warfare reboot still undeniably was a COD game, but with more attention to detail, beautiful graphics and sound design, and the introduction of a 64-player game mode featuring vehicles in the form of ground war, it was understandable why so many Battlefield fans felt intrigued too. So it's also understandable why Battlefield Studios now tries to lure in COD players by focusing the open beta mostly on smaller infantry maps. And there's no problem in making gameplay and movement a bit faster, or making the game live service, implementing purchasable character and weapon skins, or if they want to introduce a BR mode later down the line. Adding new stuff like that isn't bad in and of itself. What is bad is Battlefield's tendency to forget its own identity while trying to hop on the bandwagon. Focusing way too hard on making a battle royale, implementing a half-assed live service model, introducing specialists, suddenly it has an extraction mode. Every single time it almost immediately backfires for this franchise, because putting time and effort into those modes or features means the workload is spread too thin and less time was spent on making sure that the core Battlefield experience was actually solid. It's okay for DICE, or now the Battlefield Studios, to want to appeal to a bigger audience. I'm definitely not trying to gatekeep this franchise, and I would love to see a successful BR mode, extraction mode, or whatever new mode would look like within a Battlefield title. But just like Modern Warfare 2019 being a COD game first and foremost, Battlefield 6 should definitely remain a Battlefield game. A slower-paced military shooter in war-torn urban environments or large open landscapes, many different vehicles in all-out warfare, team-oriented and objective-focused gameplay, the exact things that make Battlefield Battlefield. Which does make me, and apparently a lot of other people as well, kind of worried about what was seen during this reveal. It is absolutely great that DICE gave a bunch of content creators the opportunity to play the game early and have them voice their opinions. Honestly, I'll be the last person to tell anyone that player bases should remain separated. I'd love to have a bunch of COD or Fortnite players join the battlefield as well. But if you're going to invite a bunch of people who preferably play completely different sorts of shooters, then is the feedback they give actually worth anything? I honestly cannot keep a straight face when I hear any of these guys say that the movement needs to be faster, that the game needs a meta, that it desperately needs omni movement and slide cancelling, a battle pass or operators, ranked matches or battle royale. I feel like that's just such a huge misunderstanding, not just of what Battlefield as a whole is in its core, but also of what's wrong with many video games right now. What BF6 actually needs, just like Call of Duty, just like Fortnite, just like Halo, just like any other video game, is its own identity. If you want a shooter in which the entire gameplay loop is focused around you as a one-man army, if you don't care about playing objectives, if you don't want to help your team out by actually reviving people when you're playing as a medic, that's all fine. But maybe that just means that Battlefield isn't for you. I don't necessarily like COD anymore nowadays either. I even made a video about the aspects I don't like about it anymore. But I didn't make that video to suggest that COD will get better if it had conquest, more vehicles, or a class system just because I like those things. It's okay that Battlefield wants to appeal to fans of other games, but it shouldn't become those other games. And I only have to go back one game to show you why it shouldn't. Which is a nice little segue into the things I disliked about the game. And the best point to start is at the open beta itself and how limited of an experience it actually was. Many people saw the focus on infantry in these map designs as an early warning sign that this game wouldn't have the all-out warfare experience they'd hoped for. I shared that initial fear. If an open beta is supposed to give you a good representation of what a game is going to be like, then I would have appreciated more variety in map sizes and playstyles. However, in this regard we have to keep in mind that this is a beta and therefore not a full experience. For example, BF3's open beta back in 2011 only featured one map, Operation Metro, a narrow, infantry-focused corridor shooter which still grew out to be one of the most beloved maps in the franchise, but it absolutely wasn't a good representation of everything that Battlefield 3 had to offer. Within the developer blog posts, trailers, screenshots and data mines, we've already uncovered so many information about the fact that it will most likely be a similar situation with Battlefield 6. But that does beg the question. Why were these specific maps chosen, and why was the amount of weapons, gadgets and vehicles available to use so limited? You could of course say that an open beta is just a small showcase of a game and therefore they want to keep the big stuff hidden behind the full release. The amount of content revealed before release is always going to be a careful balancing act. You don't want the entire game out in the open before people get their hands on it, but the simple reality of modern gaming and the amount of leaks that come with that also makes it so that these developers should show things before the entire excitement already dumbs down. Keeping an open beta restricted like that makes sense to me, and I personally actually prefer it over just spoiling all the surprises before the game even comes out. But the problem with that is that EA did spoil most information already. What people mostly missed in this open beta was that true Battlefield experience, a large map with insane destruction, vehicles and all-out warfare. Something like that was shown a few weeks after the open beta on the maps Operation Firestorm and the newly introduced Mirak Valley. Two maps that weren't featured in the open beta, but instead only playable by a select group of content creators that were invited to play these maps with a bunch of extra weapons, vehicles and gadgets while also being allowed to capture footage of it. I have absolutely no problem with them getting this opportunity, but that does mean that so much of the game has already been shown at this point. It does immediately take away some of those earlier mentioned concerns. We now know that Battlefield 6 will also feature that classic Battlefield experience everyone was hoping for. But why was all of this revealed in the way it was? Why not give the open beta participants the opportunity to play on the larger map? Why not let people try out new gadgets like the sledgehammer and tactical ladder? Why not reveal more vehicles in the open beta? Why withhold that experience from an open beta and only give it to a very select group of people? I think this beta would have been much better if it only featured 2 maps, Siege of Cairo and Merak Valley. They could still have shown that new audience an infantry-focused map that probably caters more towards the experiences they are used to, but simultaneously show franchise veterans that BF6 will also have everything they like. All while giving everyone the opportunity to check out some of those new features, but not already spoiling 6 of the 9 maps that this game will release with. Top this entire multiplayer situation off with the fact that we've already gotten footage of the campaign already as well, information about the Battle Royale mode, information about the entire first season of this game's live service, and all the things that are still constantly being leaked, and you can probably understand why I have been avoiding anything Battlefield 6 related in the past weeks. There's nothing wrong with creating hype before release, but I personally would still like to have some surprises at launch. And in my opinion, the surprises would have been bigger if the open beta had less maps, but also a little less restrictions, if that makes any sense. Second of all, if these graphics are as impressive as I'm making them out to be, why do I have the feeling that it doesn't look as impressive as some of those previous installments? Well, that's because one of my personal biggest problems with Battlefield 6 comes down to the age-old discussion of graphical fidelity versus artistic direction. You cannot deny that Battlefield 6 looks good, but when I compare the bland, muted tones of Liberation Peak to something like Monte Grappa, FL 652, or even Exposure, there's no doubt in my mind that my preferences go to the games with much more stylized, visually pleasing sceneries. I get it, BF6 desperately wants to be more like BF3, and I'm convinced that these muted colors were chosen because, just like that game, it goes for a more serious and gritty atmosphere. But one of BF3's biggest complaints throughout the years was this exact excessive use of blue, orange and grey color filters plastered onto an otherwise beautiful looking game. And now BF6 just goes back to that? I mean seriously, a piss filter in the year of our Lord 2025? Of course, this is a highly subjective matter and many people probably love this return to 2011. But in my opinion, it heavily restricts how good BF6 actually looks and even makes a lot of the maps we were able to play on feel much more similar to each other than they actually are. I really do hope to see some more variety in style and art direction throughout this game's life cycle. Hell, it would be great to see them dial back these filters a little bit if you ask me. Thirdly, I want to at least mention the fact that server browsers are some of the most underrated features in online games, and these developers would be absolutely insane to not feature a dedicated server browser in Battlefield 6. With a game that proudly promotes the fact that it has over 600 plus customization options on PC, I cannot in my right mind understand why the game's UIs and menus get less clear and more restricted with each release. The sheer ease with which you can find a match that fits your exact preferences in games like BF4 and 1 makes BF6 look like a laughingstock. You want to give your players all the freedom in the world by giving them all the options and all the customizations in a game made by 4 development studios on a budget that could feed an entire country for a year, but a dedicated server browser is where the line is drawn because the servers are too expensive? That's ridiculous. And I know that some people might say this game is going to have a server browser in the form of Battlefield Portal. Yes, you're right. But I only have to look back at 2042, with its lack of filters, search options, official servers, and endless rows of goddamn AFK XP farms, to tell you that it might as well didn't have one. Despite the developers already talking a lot about patching stuff and reworking things here and there before the release, I still feel like there's one thing about the gameplay I specifically want to point out. No pun intended, but I'm talking about the active spotting, which is awful. If you've played BF4, you know everything about how your HUD was filled with those little orange spotting markers throughout a match. The fact that this whole situation made it so that people were much more focused on shooting in the general direction of these little markers instead of actually looking for an enemy, going so far that BF4 even got the nickname of Dorito Shooter, makes it ridiculous that BF6 seems to be heading in an exact same direction 12 years later. Spotting is an important aspect of Battlefield, of course, and I really dislike the fact that the open beta didn't feature the nice little spotting animation. But this is not the way to implement it, and I hope they will find a solution. I also want to quickly talk about something that I don't necessarily see as a bad aspect of the game, but something that is concerning me. The Battlefield franchise so far just hasn't had the best track record regarding its live service models. Completely half-assed in BF5, it was at least comforting to see that they started to get the hang of it in 2042. What concerns me, however, is the fact that live service models and the subsequent battle passes that come with it can drastically change the way a game looks and feels at the end of its run. Battlefield 6 has made such a positive first impression during the 2 open beta weekends. It really was refreshing to see so many people being positive about an FPS. But everyone also talks about how that is in large part because of the game's grounded and authentic setting, standard soldier attire, lack of skins, charms and operators, etc. We know for a fact that these things will be added in the full release, we know what some of these are going to look like already, but we still don't know how far they are going to take this. Even when looking at the cosmetics that you can earn for Battlefield 6 in 2042's final battle pass, we can already see some color schemes that definitely aren't over the top, but absolutely less grounded than the realistic, earthy tones of the soldiers and vehicles in the open beta. This is much more like what we've seen in BF4, which I'm totally okay with, but as I've said before, this is still EA we're talking about. I'm not expecting them to actually throw Beavis and Butthead into the game, but on the other hand, they've done much worse stuff in the past. But that brings me to the one thing I actively dislike the most about Battlefield 6, which is probably the most divisive aspect of the game. No matter how you look at it, no matter if you like the way it is implemented in Battlefield 6 or not, Battlefield games should always have class-specific guns, and I will gladly die on this hill. Let me explain. All Battlefield games vary wildly in which class could use which category of guns. In my opinion, every single new game that came out always felt like DICE themselves were constantly trying to find which guns would fit which class the best, and which combinations would result in the most balanced experience. In Bad Company 2, medics had light machine guns, but since that felt too overpowered, they changed it, which is how we got the support class, and so on. Changing things up helps in finding out what balances out the classes. What definitely doesn't help is giving every single class access to everything. Battlefield 2042 was the first game in which this was implemented, and it was widely panned as one of the most distinct reasons why it doesn't feel like a true Battlefield game. On a surface level, it of course makes classes less distinct from each other, which is annoying me more than it should, but I'm willing to admit that it is absolutely the least concerning part of this. Let's say you use a sniper, very effective on longer ranges and more suited to spot targets for your teammates that go for a more close quarters approach. That role gets exemplified by the equipment you're being given by that class, as well as that it also leaves this class with some glaring but necessary weak spots. You cannot heal yourself, you cannot resupply yourself with ammo, you don't have the most effective tools against vehicles. Now, however, you can just equip a sniper as a medic and heal yourself from an already very secure spot in the distance while not using any sort of equipment to spot targets for your team. Also, you're a medic. What the hell are you doing in the back of the map with a sniper while you should be healing your teammates on the front line? Or what about equipping a sniper as the support class and endlessly resupplying yourself with ammo so you never have to move your ass from your camping spot? What about giving an assault rifle equipped with a grenade launcher to the engineer class, a class that is already armed to the teeth with explosives? Remember that medics lost the ability to use LMGs for balancing reasons? Well, apparently balancing is overrated in newer Battlefield titles. Believe me when I say that I understand why the Battlefield studios want to give the player the opportunity to play in any way they want, and in that regard it is at least nice to see that some weapon categories get certain benefits within specific classes. But that still feels like solving a problem that wasn't even there in the first place. DICE literally created the most effective, well-balanced class system with class-specific weapons in Battlefield 1 and 5, which everyone loved and no one, as far as I have seen, has ever complained about, yet they still felt the need to change it up. Reverting to this obviously inferior system only encourages solo play and gives players the opportunity to create unbalanced, overpowered one-man army setups, while simultaneously discouraging team play and making one of Battlefield's biggest problems objectively even bigger: people not playing their intended role. So yeah, it sucks, and I'm convinced the developers know this themselves as well, because putting a separate playlist in this open beta only shows every player that even they cannot agree on it. In conclusion, the Battlefield 6 open beta made a very positive first impression on many of its players. If the core gameplay as well as the aesthetic of the game remains largely the same as what we've seen here, I don't have a lot to be concerned about. It features many things that people really enjoyed about previous titles, which might not make it the most exciting release ever, but in today's gaming landscape, maybe it's okay to not get the most revolutionary and unique new ideas every time. Maybe a AAA developer that seems to listen to its audience and actually gives them what they really want is everything we need right now. Graphically, Battlefield 6 continues the long-standing trend of developer DICE, accompanied now by 3 other very talented studios, of setting a new benchmark for what is possible in a massive online multiplayer shooter. Specifically in the special effects department, the game feels like a truly impressive achievement, and I'm so happy to not have to worry about a Battlefield game working on launch basically for the first time ever. With a wide variety in guns, gadgets and vehicles, it was somewhat disappointing to see a rather limited amount being actually usable in the open beta. It makes sense as far as a beta goes, but it does create a heavily restricted version of what the actual game is going to offer. I'm personally not worried about it because there's already so much information available about everything the game will offer on launch, including not only a more complete multiplayer experience, but also a new and improved Portal mode, the return of a single-player campaign, and even a battle royale later down the line. What I am worried about is its live service model. The simple fact with modern gaming is that the game that will be released and the game it eventually turns into can be 2 completely different products. People are so positive about the game's more authentic setting and distinct lack of crazy skins and other cosmetics, something that is flooding the FPS market right now, and the developers have spoken out about not having any plans to drastically change the game's setting right now. But you can never know for sure in this day and age, which is why those last 2 words speak louder than any other. Most of the things I personally don't like the heavy color filters, active spotting and non-specific weapons for classes, might make the overall experience a little less enjoyable for me, but that doesn't make this a bad game, even if everything remains exactly the same as in this open beta. The core of what I want from a Battlefield game is here in all of its glory, and seems to be running on all cylinders in the full release. The Battlefield studios have sincerely created something with a massive amount of potential here, but if later updates, game modes, customizations and battle passes change things too radically, that potential could disappear faster than DICE's support for Hazard Zone. Thanks for watching. As always, I really hope you enjoyed this video. Of course, I love to know what you guys thought of the open beta as well, and if you're excited for the game's full release. Be sure to check my channel around the time that the game releases, because I will make videos about it when that happens. If you like anything Battlefield related, check out the rest of my channel, since there's a lot of Battlefield videos on there. And of course, a special thanks for all the people that are still hanging around on my channel. Your ongoing support is something I genuinely appreciate, so thank you. For now, thanks for watching again, and I really hope to see you in the next video. Bye!